So the Ring magazine is up and running, and now we have our first show in the UK, April the 26th, taking place in Tottenham Hotspur Stadium. We've not only just had the main event, but we've also had the undercard announced for this show. Kicking off with a bang. When you see a new organization, although the Ring is not a new organization, but it's their first time doing their own shows. It's taking place in London, big boxing city, and it's going to have Chris Eubank Jr. versus Conor Benn. A bit of a strange fight. A fight that, if you had said to people, say 5 years ago, say 2020, that we're going to see Conor Benn versus Chris Eubank Jr. at some point, I think a lot of people would have just looked and said, how? Because you got to bear in mind, Conor Benn, 147 pounder, and even not at the time, he wasn't really the biggest 147 pounder a couple of years ago. And Chris Eubank Jr. was going back between 168 to 160. So weight-wise, it kind of seemed like, they'd never end up meeting, but they are. And we'll talk about that fight more now in a wee bit, but let's just have a quick look at the undercard. Now, on this undercard, we've got Liam Smith versus Aaron McKenna. Now, Liam Smith, the last time he fought was actually against Chris Eubank Jr. In that fight, he didn't look particularly good. It did appear as though he was, carrying a bit of an injury, so that maybe would have compromised them, because you got to remember, that fight took place in September of 2023. In January of that same year, he looked very much devastating in beating Chris Eubank Jr. Knocked him out in 4 rounds. So, Liam Smith, we don't really know where he's at now. In fairness, he's not getting any younger. He's getting a bit up there in age, and Aaron McKenna is young, he's hungry, he's game, he's undefeated. But Liam Smith, write him off at your peril. Whatever you want to say about Liam Smith, he's normally very, very durable. He has underrated punching power, and he's not gonna take a loss going down easy. He is gonna fight you all the way through. So that's gonna be on the undercard. We've got Chris Billum Smith against Brandon Glenton, and Chris Billum Smith, this will be his first fight back after his loss to Zurdo Ramirez. He obviously fought him in Saudi Arabia back in November on the Latino night show. He started that fight very well against Zurdo Ramirez, but Zurdo showed his extra class. Zurdo is a tremendously talented fighter. He's come from 168 all the way up to cruiserweight, and a lot of people, myself included, look at Zurdo as someone who, I'm not gonna say he's the beating of Jay Opetaia, because I'd make Opetaia favourite, but he's definitely in with a shout there. He's a good fighter. But CBS is one of the more improved fighters I've seen over the last couple of years. He lost to Richard Riakporhe back in 2019. A lot of people felt that fight was very, very close, very competitive. The second fight they had wasn't close, wasn't competitive. It was a clear, resounding win for CBS. So he's really improved as a fighter. He did take a lot of punishment in there, though, against Zurdo Ramirez. So we're going to need to see how he's going to look in this respective comeback fight. Vidal Riley versus Chev Clark. That's actually going to be an interesting fight. Chev Clark coming off the back of a loss. He lost up at European level. He's a very big, muscular, very physically imposing, very physically strong cruiserweight. He definitely packs a punch. Now, Vidal Riley had been training for Isaac Chamberlain. He was meant to face Isaac Chamberlain on February the 1st. Chamberlain pulled out with an injury. Now, Chamberlain is he's more of a pure boxer. He's not the biggest puncher, and at cruiserweight, he's not the most physically strong. In fact, that's probably been one of his biggest shortcomings at cruiserweight, is that lack of punching power and that lack of physical strength. So that it's going to be altogether a different, puzzle for Vidal Riley to try and work out. Now, Vidal Riley in his own right, yes, he's got a bit of power there, yes, he's got a bit of speed, but I've seen Vidal Riley, like against Miguel Lawal, just look very pedestrian, and there's been times in his career where I've looked and thought, what am I looking at here with this guy? So this is going to be an interesting fight. Chev Clark definitely, he's at this point in his career, because he's in his mid-30s now. You got to remember that, coming out the back of a loss, he doesn't have time on his side where he can start, go and, have a couple of easy fights and then look to go in and fight Vidal Riley. He can't do it, he doesn't have time. So he's got to make hay while the sun shines. And this could be, genuinely, if he loses this fight, where you would honestly say, where would you go? So he's got a lot to prove, and as does Vidal Riley. And then we have Anthony Yarde versus Lyndon Arthur. Yes, you heard me correctly. Anthony Yarde versus Lyndon Arthur. In my opinion, this is a fight that doesn't need to happen. I've got no problem with Anthony Yarde being on this card. In fact, I've said it before. I enjoy watching Anthony Yarde, and I think that he always is a good watch when he's in there with someone who's going to push him close. I don't think Lyndon Arthur is going to be the guy to do that. And the reason why I don't think he's going to be the guy to do that is because it has been over 3 years since they last fought. This is their third fight. It's a trilogy that no one asked for. And for me, that just kind of, I don't know. I'm not really sold on that fight. I think it's going to be a fairly resounding win for Anthony Yarde. I much would have preferred to have seen Anthony Yarde go in there against someone like maybe a Dan Aziz. Although Dan Aziz hasn't looked amazing lately, you know, he's lost two fights now, if I'm not mistaken, but he's definitely had some bad form. But on his day, Dan Aziz is a very, very good fighter, and I think him against Anthony Yarde, because we haven't seen it yet, it would have given me a little bit of interest. And he's a different style. He's a completely different style to Lyndon Arthur. Lyndon Arthur is very much a back foot boxer. He's got a very good jab. He relies a lot on that jab. So I think Dan Aziz maybe would have been a better shout if you want to do a domestic clash. But that will be on the card. And I've already talked about it very briefly, but we'll touch on it now again. Chris Eubank Jr. versus Conor Benn. You know, this fight, it's, how many years do you want to say in the making? Really, it's over 2 years in the making. They were meant to fight in October. October 22. It didn't happen. It's now happening. You can say, we all know why it didn't happen, and we all have an opinion on that, but now it is happening. It's happening at 160, so it's happening at middleweight. The last fight, I believe, was contract. I think it was at 158 or 159 with a rehydration clause. I've always said it. I don't particularly like the rehydration clause for any fighter, to be honest, which I'm very much old school in the sense of if you've made weight, that's fine. That's the most important thing. You've made the weight. You don't need any rehydration clause. And if there is one there and you know it's going to affect one fighter more than it's going to affect the other, if the fighter who it doesn't really affect that badly wins, you can't look at it and say, oh, wow, that's a brilliant achievement, because there's always that, you know, there's always that question mark, but like, yeah, but how bad did the rehydration clause affect the other respective fighter? So that's going to be a major point of contention in this fight. But this fight, I believe Chris Eubank Jr. has opened as the favourite, and I would make him the favourite going into this fight. I think that Conor Benn, his last two performances, he hasn't looked quite as impressive. He's been in there, and you know, Eddie Hearn, you know, has actually said in the past that, you know, oh, well, Conor Benn didn't knock those guys out because they were basically middleweights, but he's going to knock Chris Eubank Jr. out. You're like, Eddie, just got to point out the elephant in the room on that one. It's going to be interesting to see if Conor Benn can make a dent in Chris Eubank Jr. Chris Eubank Jr. was someone who put a lot of faith in having a good chin. Now, I believe in that Liam Smith fight, the first fight, that he must have been weight drained following on from back-to-back tough camps. He had no break from making weight for the Conor Benn fight, which didn't happen, to going straight into the Liam Smith fight. So I think that you'd be right if you said maybe that affected his punch resistance. If he's not weight drained, he should take those shots quite well. He hits quite hard, Chris Eubank Jr. He's not the biggest puncher in the world, but hard enough. Conor Benn, I don't know quite how he's going to take those shots, to be honest with you. I really don't. So it's going to be very, very interesting. Let me know your thoughts. Love to hear it. People's thoughts on this card. The first Ring Magazine show announced April the 26th, Tottenham Hotspur in the UK. People, let me know. I hope you enjoyed this video so much. Thank you, and I'll talk to you. Peace.